50 feet off the ground. 250 miles an hour. The tree line is flashing past the canopy like a strobe light. Hedgerow, farmhouse, power line, gone. And the pilot is not thinking about any of it consciously, because if he has to think about it, he's already too slow. This is not a display flight. This is not an exercise for the cameras. This is Tuesday morning in RAF Germany. And the man in that cockpit is training for the worst day in European history. The Cold War is not cold here. Not in the cockpits of RAF Germany, where men practice, every week, every month, every year, for a war that the intelligence estimates say could last less than a week before Europe is unrecognizable. They have a name for what the Soviets plan to do. They call it the echelons. Wave after wave of armored divisions, moving west so fast that NATO won't have time to organize a coherent defense before the momentum becomes a catastrophe. It has another name too, the one the pilots use, the Soviet Avalanche. An unstoppable mass of steel and men and firepower moving west with one purpose, to bury everything in its path before anyone could react. NATO's answer, or part of it, is a small, angular British jet that nobody outside the military has ever really heard of. The SEPECAT Jaguar. This is its story. To understand why the Jaguar exists, you need to understand what NATO was actually afraid of. Not nuclear war, at least not as the opening move. The scenario that kept NATO planners awake at night was conventional. A massive armored offensive through Central Europe, launched with enough speed and enough weight that the West's ability to respond would collapse before it could be organized. The place they worried about most had a name: the Fulda Gap. A corridor of relatively flat terrain in West Germany, running between the East German border and Frankfurt. And Frankfurt means the Rhine. Cross the Rhine in force, and you've effectively cut NATO's ground defenses in half. The Soviets had spent 2 decades building a tank force designed to do exactly that. T-72s, T-64s, thousands of them, backed by mechanized infantry, self-propelled artillery, attack helicopters, and a doctrine built around one principle above all others: speed, always speed. The idea wasn't to outfight NATO in a long war of attrition. The idea was to move so fast, in such overwhelming numbers, that the political will to resist would break before the military capacity to resist could form. Think of an avalanche. You don't fight an avalanche head-on. You either get out of its way, or you find a way to stop it before it reaches full momentum. That was the Soviet doctrine in one image. A wall of steel moving west with the weight and speed of a natural disaster, and no intention of slowing down for anything. The avalanche was coming. That was the threat. And NATO needed an answer. When people talk about Cold War aircraft, the jets that defined the era, they talk about the F-15, the F-16, the Tornado, the MiG-29. Nobody talks about the Jaguar. It doesn't have the glamour. It never got a Hollywood film. It wasn't built to set airshow records. It's angular and compact and slightly odd-looking. And if you saw one parked next to an F-15, you might not even notice it. Which is, in a strange way, exactly the point. The SEPECAT Jaguar was a joint project between Britain and France, born from a 1960s requirement for an advanced trainer that could also carry weapons. By the time it entered RAF service in 1974, it had become something considerably more focused, a dedicated ground attack aircraft built for one mission and one mission only. Go low, go fast, find the tanks, kill the tanks, come home. The Jaguar had no radar. It was never designed for air combat. It wasn't the fastest jet at altitude, and it wasn't the most comfortable to fly for long periods. But here is what it could do that most aircraft simply could not. It could fly at 50 feet above the ground, not in controlled conditions, not on a training range, but across real, contested, obstacle-strewn terrain, and deliver its weapons with a precision that made other aircraft look like they were guessing. Its inertial navigation system didn't just guide the aircraft. It tracked the aircraft's exact position in 3 dimensions continuously, feeding a weapons delivery computer that could calculate the precise release point, accounting for aircraft speed, wind, altitude, and weapon trajectories simultaneously. At low level, under pressure, against a moving target environment, that was the difference between a useful weapon and an expensive miss. The Jaguar also had something that most fast jets lack at low level: survivability by design. Its entire doctrine was built around the assumption that Soviet radar coverage would be dense and overlapping at medium altitude. So it didn't fly at medium altitude. It flew below the radar horizon, below the engagement envelope of most missile systems, in the narrow band of sky where speed and terrain masking offered more protection than any electronic countermeasure. The aircraft was built tough, redundant systems, a robust airframe that could absorb battle damage, because the planners knew it would have to. Low-level penetration, navigation accuracy, strike precision, survivability through speed and terrain. These weren't marketing claims. They were the engineering answers to a specific tactical problem. How do you hit armored columns deep inside a Soviet defensive umbrella and give the pilot a reasonable chance of coming home? The Jaguar was NATO's answer to the Avalanche at the sharpest end of the blade. What made it remarkable wasn't just the airframe, it was the combination of the machine and the men who flew it, and the specific, punishing, relentless way they trained. There is a calculation that NATO planners had to make, and it isn't a comfortable one to look at. In the event of a full Warsaw Pact offensive, the aircraft sent against the armored columns would face the most sophisticated ground-based air defense network ever assembled. The Soviets had layered it carefully, almost obsessively. SA-6 missiles for medium altitude, SA-8s for shorter ranges, ZSU-23-4 radar-guided cannon for anything low, shoulder-launched SA-7s for anything that came lower still, and behind all of that, MiG fighters waiting for anything that made it through. The attrition estimates, when they were eventually declassified, made for uncomfortable reading. Some projections suggested NATO could expect to lose between a third and half of its ground attack aircraft in the first days of a high-intensity war. Let that settle for a moment. Half. The Jaguar crews knew this. They weren't naive. The culture of RAF Germany during the Cold War carried a weight that veterans find difficult to describe to people who weren't there. You were preparing for something that would, if it happened, almost certainly kill a significant number of you. And you trained anyway. Every month, every quarter, every year, for as long as it lasted. The mission profile was demanding to the point of being physically punishing. Low-level navigation across Germany required a level of sustained concentration that most people can only manage for short periods. Landmarks rushing past at nearly 5 miles a minute. Calculations being made and remade in real time. Checks and rechecks. And all of this while managing the aircraft, monitoring the threat environment, communicating with the formation, and staying close enough to the ground that a single moment of inattention could be immediately and permanently fatal, not from enemy action, but simply from physics. There is a phrase that veterans of RAF Germany use sometimes quietly when they're trying to explain what it was like. Controlled terror. Not quite fear, something more professional. An acknowledgement of how precisely small the margin was between doing it right and not going home. And in the back of every cockpit, in every briefing room, in every debrief over cold coffee, the same unspoken awareness. The Avalanche was still coming. They were training to slow it down. If you want to understand how seriously the RAF took the Jaguar's mission, look at the exercises. Red Flag in Nevada. Tactical fighter meets across Europe. The regular deployments to Decimo Manu in Sardinia. These were the events where theory got tested against something approaching reality, where you could see, in practice, whether all those months of preparation were adding up to anything. And the Jaguar crews developed a reputation. Not for speed, because the Jaguar wasn't the fastest thing in the exercise area. Not for dogfighting, because if it came to a turning fight, the Jaguar would generally lose. But for something rarer and more valuable in the context of their actual mission, low-level navigation. The almost eerie ability to arrive at exactly the right point, at exactly the right time, at an altitude that made other pilots visibly uncomfortable to watch from the ground. The radar controllers at Red Flag noticed it first. Most aircraft, even those flying low, would appear on radar long enough to generate a track, long enough for the controllers to simulate a realistic intercept. The Jaguar formations were different. They came in so low and so fast, using the folded terrain of the Nevada desert in ways that seemed almost intelligent, that controllers would pick up a fleeting return, a ghost contact, gone before it could be confirmed. And then, the aircraft would be inside the defended zone before anyone could react. One controller, years later, described it this way. You'd be watching the scope, and there'd be nothing, then nothing, then nothing, and then they'd call simulated weapon release, and your target was already dead. It wasn't a technology gap. It was a skill gap. Those guys had practiced until the terrain was part of their thinking. Veterans who flew multiple red flag deployments described the exercise as the closest thing to real war that peacetime could offer. And the Jaguar crews consistently came away from it with something that went beyond scores on a debrief sheet. There was a moment, the experienced ones will tell you, when you stopped thinking about the techniques and started feeling them. When the aircraft stopped being a collection of systems and became an extension of your intention. When you'd roll off the ridge, pull the nose down into the valley, and the release point would just be there, not calculated, but known. That was what all the months over Germany had been building toward. That was why the RAF flew its Jaguar crews so hard, so long, so relentlessly. They were training for the Avalanche, and at Red Flag, you could see it working. The Jaguar's navigation suite, updated progressively through the 1970s and 80s, was genuinely impressive for its era. An inertial navigation system, a moving map display, a weapons delivery computer that could account for wind and aircraft motion and release point geometry simultaneously. These weren't afterthoughts bolted on. They were the heart of what made the aircraft work at the mission it had been designed for. But technology only takes you so far. The rest, the part that the exercises proved over and over, was the people. These people were doing something exceptional, not just training hard. That phrase is too small for it. They were transforming themselves, through sheer accumulated repetition, into something that the Soviets had no clean answer for at low level. They were becoming, aircraft by aircraft, crew by crew, the specific human instrument NATO needed to stop the Avalanche at its worst moment. December 1991. The Soviet Union formally ceases to exist. And with it goes the scenario that an entire generation of NATO aircrew had spent their careers preparing to face. The tank armies haven't dissolved overnight. The hardware is still there, technically. But the political architecture that would have launched it westward, that is gone. Permanently. The spring that was coiled for 40 years is finally, irrevocably, released. The Avalanche never came. Think about what that means for the men involved. Thousands of sorties, tens of thousands of flying hours. Careers built around a mission that was always theoretical and is now definitively historical. All of that preparation, the marriages that strained under the pressure, the hearing damaged by years in the cockpit, the friends who didn't come back from training accidents over the German countryside, and the war it was all aimed at simply didn't happen. How do you feel about that? Some veterans will tell you they feel nothing but relief. Of course. The alternative was catastrophic. A war that the planning exercises suggested could kill hundreds of thousands of people in its first days. A Europe that might have come through it unrecognizable. If they had to fly those missions, history would have been broken in ways it might never have recovered from. But underneath the relief, if you listen carefully, there is something else. Not regret, exactly. Not disappointment. Something more complicated. Something about the nature of a life organized around a purpose that turns out to be unnecessary. The Jaguar crews had trained for a specific version of history, and history went somewhere else. And then, just when the Jaguar might have been expected to quietly retire, to become a museum piece, a Cold War footnote, history gave it one more chapter. August 1990. Iraq invades Kuwait. Operation Desert Storm begins in January 1991, and the RAF deploys its Jaguar force to Bahrain. The aircraft that spent 2 decades training for the forests and river valleys of Germany now finds itself over the flat, sun-bleached expanse of the Iraqi desert. 2 decades. Think about that for a moment. Every hour flown at 50 feet over the Rhine Valley, every red flag debrief, every cold morning on the ramp at Bruggen. All of it had been rehearsal for a war in Central Europe that never materialized. Now in the desert, the question was whether that preparation had built something transferable. Whether the skills sharpened against the Soviet threat could function against a different enemy, in a different landscape, under a different sky. The answer, largely, was yes. It was a different kind of war in almost every way. Different threat environment, different climate, different rules of engagement. The terrain offered no cover, no tree lines to hug, no hills to hide behind. And the enemy's air defenses, while formidable, were of a different character to the layered Soviet network the Jaguar had been built to penetrate. The Gulf War. Jaguars flew anti-shipping missions over the Persian Gulf. Ground attack sorties against Iraqi positions and infrastructure. Reconnaissance missions, photographing the battlefield for the commanders below. It was not the war the aircraft had been designed for. The avionics, which had been genuinely cutting edge in 1974, were showing their age by 1991. There were losses. There were limitations. No aircraft is perfect in a real war, and the Jaguar was no exception. But the precision navigation, honed over years of Cold War training, was real. The low-leaked Bell instincts, built through thousands of sorties over Germany, were real. The crews who had spent careers preparing for the Avalanche arrived in the Gulf with something that couldn't be improvised in the weeks before combat. Genuine, deep, embodied competence under pressure. 20 years of Cold War preparation had been tested finally in real combat. And the Jaguar performed. The Jaguar had spent 20 years as a theoretical weapon. The Gulf proved it was a real one.